Hey there guys, Pastor Gary here once again with you from Calvary Chapel, deep inside our studio here where the techie guys hang out and turn more and more pale every day. But now we're here in our studio and we love bringing you these special little features to kind of teach you a little supplemental something or other. And of course we're going through our Study 66 right now where we're going through each of the books, and we last left with Joshua, and now we're going into the book of Judges, and so that makes us right on track to where we want to be, and we're hoping to do this in around a year's time or so to take you on a survey through the Bible. Now the supplemental part of this that we're doing right now, Study 66, this is going off-road. We call it Study 66 Off-Road because we want to delve just a little deeper, maybe look at something in particular. So since we're in the book of Judges, and I think sometimes people look at Judges as a disconnected book because they sort of look at it and they go, well, we had the law, we had the Torah, Moses wrote most of what's in there for that, and then we go into Joshua, and of course Joshua is connected to Moses because Joshua was the understudy to Moses. Moses trained up Joshua is what he did. Often in church vernacular, we will say, hey, who is the Joshua that you're training up right now? And of course, what we mean by that is, who are you mentoring and who are you dealing with and trying to bring them up in the faith, as it were. You know, it's sort of like Timothy would have been a Joshua to Paul. But so as we look at this and as we now get into Joshua, or Judges, excuse me, we now find what I think is a deficiency in what's going on here. You had Moses training up Joshua, laying hands on him, and basically ordaining him in front of the people to lead the children of Israel into the promised land. We've got that. Then we come to Joshua. Joshua leads, does a wonderful job in leading in the military battles and those types of things. In fact, gives one of the most beautiful speeches at the end there of Joshua. You know, choose you this day whom you will serve. You can see it, and it's almost like that George Patton movie where George C. Scott is standing in front of the American flag and giving that rousing speech, and it's sort of one of those moments, you know. But then we find in the book of Judges, in the very beginning there, where it says Joshua basically dies. And what we go into, we don't go into a Joshua-esque story in the book of Judges. We go into what is a moral bankruptcy of the people when it comes to that. And so we're going to examine a little bit of that and see how that can be implemented into our lives, into the life of a church, to your families, and see, well, how do we stave off that kind of mentality, you know, where we're going along so well and then something comes along and unfortunately causes it to slide away. And we don't certainly want to do that. So looking at the book of Judges, probably written from the prophet Samuel, probably, we can't say it for sure. There's some Jewish writings that lend themselves to the idea that it was Samuel. In fact, they will tell you, the Babylonian Talmud would tell you that it was Samuel that wrote this. The timing of it is during the early portion of the monarchy. That could be anywhere from 1050 to 1000 BC. So probably shortly after Saul is being coronated as the king. Remember, Samuel served at the behest of Saul in that particular time. And so why was that particularly written? Because it was a warning. It seems to be a warning, like Samuel is trying to say, or whoever did write this, is trying to say to the successive kings that are coming along, look, you better fly right. You better do the right thing. And if you don't, you're going to end up with this chaos that's going on around us, is what it is. This is kind of the idea when good people have gone bad, you know. And so there's a lot to that. There's a text, Judges 21 and 25. Judges 21:25 says, in those days there was no king in Israel, so everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So the first thing I want you to notice about that particular text in those days. So obviously being written from someone who's going, well, in those days, back in those days, it's someone reflecting backwards. How far backwards, we're not quite sure. But again, probably could be Samuel. So the first thing he draws attention to, well, back in that time, there was no king in Israel. The second thing he says, that led to a certain amount of anarchy, is what it did. When everyone did what was right in his own eyes. We see that today. You know, everyone wants to do what they think is the right thing to do. They all proclaim that I have the right to do what I want to do. And the truth is, you don't have the right to do what you want to do in any manner that you want to do it. We have laws and restrictions that say, look, your rights don't supersede the next person's rights. We need to learn how to collectively get along is what we need to do. And so we have a constitution that gives us the right to do certain things, but because you get your car license does not mean you can drive on sidewalks. But I want to drive on the sidewalks. Well, you have no right to drive on a sidewalk. There's restrictions that come along. So society functions. That's why we do these things. So as we get into this, you're going to see the problems that go on here. First of all, in chapters 1, basically through chapter 3, early portion, probably around verse 6, that's about a 20-year period is what it is. And it's giving us general background of things. It's kind of giving us a general overview of everything. The body of the book of Judges then we'll pick up in chapter 3, around 7 or so there, and it goes to about chapter 16, verse 31. Now listen, everything in the book of Judges is not chronological. But this will cover about a 260-year span of time. But again, it's not all chronological. All the judges don't serve in a chronological way. It seems like that as you read it, but there's some discrepancies there too. And then finally, you have a 20-year period from chapter 17 through to the very end, chapter 21, and I believe it's verse 25 there. So that gives you the breakdown of the book. Again, you get the background, you get the body of it, but then you also kind of get the epilogue of what's going on. I remember as a little kid watching cop shows, and it would talk about epilogue at the end of it. So that gives you an epilogue. There's a huge message that we're looking at here in the book of Judges. And of course, Moses is raising up a Joshua. We have that happening. So we see discipleship, we see followership. We see a great leadership, a transference is what we see. You know, it's continuing on is what it is as Moses pours in to Joshua. The problem was Joshua didn't prepare necessarily who would follow him. It's typical of a lot of churches. Many churches will start out, but the leader neglects to raise people up. The leader neglects to pour into people. And what you will subsequently end up with is a pretty good beginning, but usually, unfortunately, it falls into a disrepair, and it can be fatal to a church. It can be fatal to any business. If you run a business, it can be fatal to your business if you're not intentional about training up people and making sure that you have the next generation coming in. So you went from Moses to Joshua, but sadly, then you went into the book of Judges, where every man did what was right in his own eyes. Don't forget that. That's going to be our slogan here as we continue through this. And that's where you see real moral decline happening, as it were. There's this leaking of purpose. Understand, if you're not intentional about that mission, if you're not intentional about staying the course and guarding that mission, it will leak. Vision leaks. That's what happens. And you lose the idea of what you started out with. Nothing wrong with being flexible. Nothing wrong with doing things differently in method and everything else. But if in a church setting you believe you are called by God to do something, then you need to stick with it, and you need to understand that. And so that's what happens. I believe in the world we live today, as I look around, that we are in what I would call the age of judges, the judges' age. Ministries and ministers even are being canceled because they're outside of this culture or what's perceived to be in this culture. And if you're not willing to compromise, if you're not willing to kind of get along, you will be canceled. And unfortunately, I understand that by the outside world. I understand why they would look at us and say, well, your message is out of date, and you're not loving the way that they think loving should be. And so they come against you. And I can see the outside world doing that because our message is so different than what their message is. But when I see people that come to our churches, I talk to other pastors all the time, and they'll come in shell shock, like, I never saw that coming. This family, these people have accused me of not being loving enough, have accused me of being dogmatic on principles, and maybe it's time that we stop teaching what that Bible is saying and start compromising with the world around us. If you want to be influential in this world, you've got to get along in this world. The problem with that is I never saw Jesus say that. I never saw Paul say that. It's not a matter of compromising to get along with the world. We have a message that we deliver, but remember, it's a message that needs to be delivered in love. So no argument there. I unequivocally agree with that statement, that it's a message that needs to be delivered in love. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that. And so sometimes you get pressured into these things that you feel like you got to do to confront. And so anyway, as this world is transforming around us, what we're losing in leadership, sadly, is leaving a big hole. We're kind of in the age of judges because our Joshuas are passing away. I look at Pastor Chuck here in particular with Calvary Chapel, and just the giant footprint that he kind of made, being used by God to be raised up to lead something like this, and the influence that he's had. And since Pastor Chuck is gone, there's definitely, you can see where leadership and things that we need to kind of get back to the idea of training up young guys to come into the pulpits and stand for truth. And if we don't, not only do we see it in many other denominations and associations, but we'll see it right here at Calvary Chapel also if we're not careful. And so it's an important message, it really is, that we get in this particular book of Judges, that's for sure. Now, if you're thinking in the book of Judges and you're just thinking that a judge is a judge, Judge Wapner, Judge Judy, whatever judge you're thinking of, it's not necessarily that. What a judge in this particular era is looked at, first of all, is like a deliverer. It's a person who is brought up on the stage, the spotlight, to deliver the nation from what it's going through. Also, by the way, it's believed by Bible scholars that you might have more than one judge operating at a time in different regions of Israel. So it doesn't necessarily mean there was just one judge one time. It could mean that they're being used in different eras. Some people refer to him almost as a Messiah. And I don't like to do that because I think that takes away from, of course, Christ. But they definitely are a type of deliverer. There's no doubt about that. We also know that a judge can be referred to as a ruler, that they will rule over the people. Deborah was a judge that did that. Chapter 4, verse 4, chapter 8, verse 28, chapter 12, verse 7. That's where we see judges who are also ruling. And there's also a prophetic voice in what the judges come on the scene and do. And so they have an important role to come and to fill in. There's no doubt about it. There were good judges, got it right, and there were some judges that weren't so good, that didn't do so hot and didn't do so well. And of course, the very nature of having judges on the scene is as a result of Joshua dies. We're waiting for the period of the kings to start. So it's not necessarily historical, the book of Judges, meaning it was just written to be historical, to kind of fill in the gap, the in-between of this time. But what it really was it's theological in the sense that God is showing us the need and what he was using to fulfill that time period until the kings would be brought on and do what they're going to do. This next section, I'm just going to read it to you because I lifted this. It's completely stolen from one of the writings here. And if I remembered it off the top of my head, I would tell you. It might be Insight for Living, where it came from. And what's said there is, we think about the Judges as both a period of time and a book of the Bible, The period of the judges began after the death of Joshua in the early 14th century BC and continued until Saul was crowned king of Israel by the prophet Samuel in 1051 BC. The book of Judges acts as the sequel. I think that's an incredible way to put it. The book of Judges acts as the sequel to the book of Joshua. So you see that they are still connected. That thread that runs through the Bible is still right at forefront, at the center. It's the sequel to the book of Joshua, linked by comparable accounts of Joshua's death that we get there. Events within the book of Judges span the geographical breadth of the nation, happening in a variety of cities, towns, and battlefields. Scholars believe some of the judges ruled in simultaneous fashion. In other words, one's ruling here, maybe one's ruling there. So in different geographical regions. Attempts to calculate the exact amount of time covered in Judges are inconclusive, but generally, the book begins soon after the death of Joshua and ends in the years just before the entrance of Samuel onto the scene, a period of about 300 years there. The contents of Judges were likely not written chronologically. The final few chapters, 17 through 21, give an overview of the moral climate during these days, and rather than occurring after the period of the judges listed earlier in the book, they probably happened in and around the times of various judges mentioned in earlier chapters. Thus, insight there saying, listen, we can't chronologically place these things in an order that says they happened one right after another. And it could be that these things are attributed earlier in different judges' lives and so forth. I say all that to you just to say sometimes the book of Judges sort of has a mysterious quantity or quality about it because it's so hard just to nail down is what it is. Something else about this, besides the fact that it's the bridge between the end of Joshua and the time of the kings, again, don't take it necessarily as historical fact record, but you got to take it in the theological bent that it was meant to be. And what happens theologically, what happens when there's not a godly leader on the scene? This again is where I believe Joshua, it's hard to say Joshua failed the people, but the style of leadership, there certainly wasn't anyone being raised up to successively take over. And so what Judges shows us is when everyone then, so no king is brought up, and so everyone just naturally did what was right in their own eyes. Who's my authority? Who's going to judge me? I'm going to do what I want to do, which again is the danger in the world that we live today. Every man's doing what is right in their own eyes. The satanic church, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. That is societal suicide, is what that is. To invoke into people the mentality, just do whatever you want to do. That's all you've got to fulfill. If it feels good, in the 60s, if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. Right? Well, we saw what that led to. STDs, broken relationships, a lot of fractured people. Well, guess what? Lawlessness is the demise of a nation. There must be accountability. There must be a sense of law and that people will heed that law. One of our early founding fathers had said, they gave us this wonderful system of government, but if you try to rule this system of government without the Bible, it'll be a miserable failure. And what he's saying is there still has to be a moral quality to the way people react and do what they want to do. If you're just making people capitulate to something because you have a whip to drive them to it, people will rebel against it also. So anyway, you find that these problems have arisen because unfortunately there wasn't any godly leadership. And if that happens to you, you'll see these major problems that certainly are coming up. We also find that in the book of Judges, whereas people broke the Abrahamic covenant, God with the land and everything else, God still remains faithful to the children of Israel, which is huge because, let's face it, so often we are We are not faithful to what God wants us to do, yet God still loves us in the way that he loves us. Think about if your salvation was based on you being perfect and good all the time, how many of us would have salvation at that point? And so it's a little bit of that also that's going on. We also see it being modeled in the book of Judges, and I think that this is very important. What we see being modeled in the book of Judges is the dynamics of sowing and reaping. What a man sows, he will also reap. Well, we see that in the book of Judges over and over. If you just consider chapter 6 as we get into Gideon right there, and you see what's going on in that way. The children of Israel are continually doing evil and doing evil and doing evil. God prepares the Midianites to come in and then to rule them for that long, and the people were being oppressed and so forth. They were doing the evil that they were doing, and God brings in the Midianites is what he does. And so you see this happening. Well, then God raises a prophet to come in. He doesn't name this prophet, by the way. This is an unnamed prophet. God brings him in, and this isn't the judge. This isn't Gideon. This is the prophet. And the prophet warns them, and he says, you think the Midianites are your problem, but the problem is you as a nation. The problem is you are rebelling against God. And so you see then the children of Israel were sowing to evil. They reaped the Midianites. The problem was they kept blaming the Midianites. The prophet comes in and says, no, it's not the Midianites. The problem is you. And it would then be Gideon that comes in and basically overthrows the oppressors at that point. And you remember, if you remember the story, you remember then he tears down the altar of Baal and he takes flack for it. They say to his dad, hey, we're going to kill him because he's tearing down that shows you how far things had gotten in Israel at that point. And so if you want to reap something different in your life, good life lesson for you, by the way. If you want to reap something different in your life, you need to sow into something different. If you're continuing to sow disorder and chaos and anarchy, and you wonder why you have these things in your life, you wonder why your families are going the way they're going, it's because you've got to change what it is you're sowing is what you need to do. And I think that's important that we do those things. And so that kind of gives you an idea of where we are when it comes to this particular book. Let me just give you a quick little Bible lesson out of here, and we'll be done in just a few minutes is what we'll be doing. I told you before, we kind of get into that first chapter there. It runs from 1 to about 3, verse 6 there. And we see that the nation, right away, we're confronted and challenged with the idea that the nation is going off the skids already. But it gives us the reason why that it's doing this way. In the first part of chapter 1, you deal with a political climate that's going on in the nation of Israel, the political foundation, if you were, And it says in chapter 1, verse 1, now after the death of Joshua, keep that in mind, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? Good that they're going to the Lord, but you see the death of Joshua left them in a state of flux. What they were really asking and what they were really saying was, who's going to lead us? Who's going to take us into this battle? We want to know who's going to do this. Why? Because whenever a nation, whenever a people aren't given good leadership, they become inconsistent. They become worried. They become, you can see it happening in and all around them is what it is. So what happens is they're told that this is what's going to go on. Judah's going to go first, and you're going to drive these people out of the land, the Canaanites again. The problem is, as we read through and as we see about this, we also see where they don't drive them out. They don't drive them. They compromise is what they did. In fact, what they did with these other nations, they just taxed them. They let them dwell there. And even worse, they dwelt with them. So that gives you the connotation that they were cohabitating with them is what they were doing. And when you do that, you go into the arena of compromise. Compromise. That's what we see. And this is what's happening here. We joke about compromise. Husbands and wives, they compromise. But we joke about it, but we know it's necessary. When it comes to your husband, when it comes to your wife, When it comes to a relationship like that, you seek out compromise. You may be things you don't want to do, but you do it because, it's going to make them happy, which is going to make the household happy. And we run on compromise. The problem is when you compromise with truth, then that's a real problem. You see, when you compromise with truth, what happens? You get the death of truth is what you get. When you put right and wrong up against each other and you allow wrong to have equal footing as you do with the right thing, then what happens is the wrong thing is what unfortunately gets more traction. It overtakes that which is right. When you have to obliterate the wrong things in your life. You have to get rid of those things. You can't compromise on them. The scripture says that righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach, is what it is. You get into the idea of the leaven, and it only takes a little bit of leaven to unfortunately compromise the whole lump, the whole loaf. Why? Because it's insidious, and that's what it does. The wrong thing just grows and grows and grows. We see it all around us, wickedness, and we've gone through all the different types of riots and everything else, and you watch what happens in these things, and it just continues to grow, and disproportionately is what it does. And so if you let evil, if you let lies, if you let immorality, if you let these things go on, you give it the inch, it takes the proverbial mile. Go back to chapter 1, verse 1 now. Now, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall be first to go up against the Canaanites? So again, we need leadership. We want to know what we need to do. We want to know where we need to go. And that's the problem. They lacked in leadership, in moral, good, godly leadership. Churches need it. People need it. We all need it. That's exactly what needs to happen. So spiritually speaking, very quickly now, in the text of chapter 2, verse 6, this is what it says. And when Joshua had dismissed the people, the children of Israel went each to his own inheritance to possess the land. Remember, they divvied up the land, showed you the boundaries and everything else there at the end of the book of Joshua. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua. Now listen to what's going on. Joshua dies. They were serving the Lord with Joshua. Joshua dies. Now the elders, they serve the Lord with the elders. But listen to what it says. Who had seen all the great works of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, or Nun, the servant of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old. And that will continue on here, verse 9. And they buried him with the border of inheritance at Timnath, Heres, in the mountains of Ephraim, on the side of Mount Gaash. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, they didn't all die at once. It wasn't one mass death. They died sporadically. But when they were all dead, another generation, you can circle that, another generation arose after them who didn't know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. They didn't even know God. What you have here, and you have this throughout the Bible, it gets repeated. Some people call it, the law of three generations, whatever you want to call it. But the reality is you have the first generation comes out of Israel. They watch all the amazing things that God does. Wow, God's an amazing God, so forth. Clouds, fires, all the stuff that he does. Second generation, which crosses into the promised land, they hear from the first generation, this is what God did. This is what God has done for us, blah, blah, blah. They see that and they're moved by it. They didn't experience it in the portion that the first one did. By the time you get here to the third one says they didn't know God. Think about it. How amazing. How in the world do you get to the point from this generation knows God, this generation doesn't know God? It takes one generation, that's all it takes, of a lack of good spiritual leadership, of people rightly dividing the word, understanding the word, teaching the godly principles of the word of truth, and not compromising on it. Because if we do that, we continue this, we are going to soon be looking around at not only a nation, but a world that absolutely has no idea of who God is. We see it more and more around us, but you're going to see even more than that in the not too distant future, I think, if we continue doing what we're doing. The good news, and we're going to close here, this is the good news. The good news is this. Many of you, I understand, we talk, you believe that we are in a very black period of time. We are in a very sinful period of time, total immorality, every man doing right in his own eyes. The good news is this, though. I used to tell my youth group this all the time. You can walk into your school hallways, you can walk in among your friends, and you're right, there's a lot of darkness in the world, but it's at that moment that you will shine the brightest, right? Why do they take a diamond and lay it on a black cloth? They don't lay it on a white cloth, they lay it on a black cloth. Why? The contrast. The contrast between you and what we see going on in this world should be profound. You should be a candle in the midst of this darkness that people can see the difference between you and them. When the judges, the good judges, came on the scene and they demonstrated who God was and what God's righteousness and holiness standard of morality was, it absolutely contrasted what the wickedness in the world was. So I hope that you take these words to heart. I hope that Sunday morning you will be in church and you will go through the rest of the book of Judges with us. And I hope that you'll take it and chew on it and live it out. We need to walk with Christ in the world we live today. We need to be the light. We need to show the people in darkness that there is truth. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see many of them come to know Jesus Christ and want to walk with Him.